If I were to tell you that I'm really an alien sent here from another planet to find out if Earth is inhabitable enough and to do experiments on the atmosphere? Shh, don't tell anyone. Would that be abnormal? Yes. What if I were just to stop functioning? What if I were just to stop putting stuff online and not grade anything and just, the popular term now is ghost everybody? What if I were to just not respond? Would that be abnormal? Yes. What takes something from just a little bit strange to abnormal? I mean, was it strange that I started this off with shh, let me tell you something? Yeah, but now you know the purpose, so it's not as strange as you think. Would it be strange if somebody suddenly broke out into the ABC song in the middle of a college class? Yeah. What is the difference between just strange and abnormal behavior? When does behavior cross the line between just a little bit weird and something to worry about? That's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about what is considered abnormal behavior. What is mental illness? What is considered an illness? What is considered enough to warrant help? First of all, I want to talk about how things are defined as abnormal. Different books talk about it slightly differently, but I like to look at it as the 4 Ds. Deviance, dysfunction, distress, and danger. And if you have any or a combination of those 4 Ds, it's a red flag that it could be abnormal. Now, having one of them may not make a difference unless it's really severe. But it's just a combination in severity of those 4 Ds. What does that mean? Deviance. Deviance means that the behavior is out of the statistical norm. It's deviant. Somebody who would take off all their clothes and run naked through the neighborhood, that would be deviant behavior. If you're sitting in a funeral and you start laughing, that would be deviant behavior. It's behavior that is outside of normal social parameters. Okay. Necessarily abnormal? Possibly. It's one of the signs. The next one, I think, mental health professionals almost see as the most important, and it's dysfunction. Is the behavior causing you to have problems living your daily life? In other words, people may be sad. Okay, I have a son going off to college. I'm going to be sad when he leaves to go off to college. Yes. Is that sadness going to be so severe that it's going to cause me to stay in the bed and not get up? That's the difference. That's dysfunction is when mental health, the problems are severe enough that it causes issues with relationships, causes issues with job, causes issues with function in your daily life. So deviance, dysfunction, distress. If a behavior worries a person, in other words, I'm sad, I don't like that, I want to get rid of it, it's causing me distress. I'm anxious, it's causing me distress. I'm hearing voices, it's causing me distress. Distress is it something that the person does not want? Is it behavior that the person doesn't want to be doing and wants to get rid of? Is it causing them to not like it? That's distress. The last one is danger. Is the person doing something that is dangerous to themselves or others? Those 4 things are signs that something is abnormal. Again, one doesn't necessarily mean it would be categorized as a mental illness. It's a combination or severity. You could have severe dysfunction and that alone would categorize it as a mental illness. It's kind of the severity of each of those. Okay, so that's how you describe it. Mental illness is also categorized according to 2 different books. DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the ICD, International Classification of Diseases. The most common here in the States is the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. If anybody's ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, they're going to get a DSM code. It's DSM-5 now. And it's a big book that lists every single psychological disorder and what the symptoms are and just details about that disorder. And it's meant for clinicians to help them diagnose. And it's diagnostic and statistical manual. It's very specific. I mean, it's a big, thick book and very specific, and it goes through revisions. Because as time goes on, remember one of the things was deviance. As time goes on, things that were culturally deviant 100 years ago are no longer culturally deviant, and vice versa. Something that was culturally acceptable 100 years ago might not be culturally acceptable now. So partially because of that, things change and it gets updated. The International Classification of Diseases is more medical, but it also includes some psychological disorders. Okay, prevalence. What's interesting is I could sit here and quote the latest numbers on a lot of the disorders. The problem with those numbers, and I'll just cut right to the chase. I can quote the numbers out the wazoos, but the problem with the numbers is that they're based on self-report data. They're based on people going to a person for treatment and that person diagnosing them and diagnosing them correctly. So, it does not include, the percentages might be higher. It doesn't include those who've never sought treatment because they're not going to get tabulated. And if a disorder is being overdiagnosed, in other words, clinicians are not accurately diagnosing disorders, it can be overdiagnosed. That's one of the thoughts that's going on right now with ADHD and some autistic spectrum disorders, that some of those are being overdiagnosed. Now, yes, do people really have ADHD and autistic spectrum disorders, Asperger's? Yes, they do. They do. There is a question, though, of in some cases, for instance, is ADHD being overdiagnosed? Okay, that being said, I want to just touch base on a little bit of prevalent stuff in terms of gender differences. There are gender differences in diagnosis of certain disorders. Females tend to be more often diagnosed with internalizing disorders like depression and anxiety. Males tend to be more diagnosed with externalizing disorders. Things like antisocial personality disorders, substance use disorders. You'll find males being more diagnosed. And it's a trend. It doesn't mean that a guy can't be depressed. Yes, they can. But there are gender differences and there are some cultural differences, because things that are seen as deviant in one culture may not be seen as deviant in another. And there's some people from some cultures are more reticent about seeking mental health services. So there's a lot of cultural differences too in terms of prevalence of mental health. That being said, probably the most common mental health disorders are anxiety and depression. Okay. Why do people have mental illness? Why do people have psychological disorders? There are three main theories that we talk about, and I'm just going to kind of go over. Historically, there were supernatural explanations. In other words, if you had a mental illness, you were possessed. The devil made me do it, so to speak. So does that happen today? Well, not to the extent that it did years and years and years ago. Is it true that some people believe that spiritual forces play some role in mental illness? Sure. Playing some role in some mental illness is a lot different than assuming anybody who's mentally ill is mentally ill because they're possessed. So yes, there are some people that believe that it is a factor, but it's no longer a leading, like this is what caused mental illness. Really, it's this environment versus biology. There are biological views on disorders. There are people out there that take a very strict biological approach. Most psychological disorders are physical in nature. It's brain chemistry brain abnormalities. And a lot of disorders, you do see differences in brain chemistry, differences in areas of the brain. There are other people that talk about environment and say mental health is largely environmental. It's the way you grew up, it's the circumstances you were in. The most common thought nowadays is the diathesis stress model. It's kind of a combo model, which is people are born with a genetic predisposition and a certain biological chemistry. That in and of itself doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a disorder, but you're born with this predisposition and brain chemistry. You're put under stress or you're put into certain environmental stimuli and it triggers a psychological disorder. That's the diathesis stress model. And that probably is the most common thought today in terms of mental health. Now, some disorders have more of the biological component. For instance, schizophrenia is one that's kind of touted as a disorder that has a very strong genetic and biological component. Now, does environment affect it? Sure. So again, it's that combo. Specific disorders. Well, we have anxiety disorders, we have mood disorders, schizophrenia, dissociative personality, and developmental. Anxiety, mood, schizophrenia, dissociative personality, and developmental. Okay, anxiety disorders. We have phobias. Phobia is when a person has an intense fear of a specific object or event. Okay, you've heard the terms claustrophobia, arachnophobia, fear of. Phobias are an intense fear of something specific, be it an object or an event. It is considered a disorder typically if it gets bad enough to affect your daily life. Social anxiety disorder falls under anxiety disorders, and this is like agoraphobia. Can be related to when kids just do not go to school, are really afraid to go to school. Social anxiety, people just do not want to be in social situations. They're scared to death of being, they get extremely nervous and anxious in social situations, debilitatingly so. Then we have two kind of common anxiety disorders, panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. Panic disorder is when a person has panic attacks. Panic attacks are a sudden rush of intense anxiety. People have described it as they feel like they're going to die. So, sudden attack of severe anxiety, and it can be often, it can be seldom, but it's when you have those panic attacks. Generalized anxiety disorder is more of a lower grade anxiety, but it just won't go away. It's like the difference in different types of pain. Difference in a stabbing, intense pain that comes and it's over and it's done with, and then a dull ache that just stays there. That's kind of the difference between panic disorder and generalized anxiety. Panic disorder is an intense rush. It's a panic attack. It's an intense rush of anxiety. Generalized anxiety, lesser grade, but it just won't go away. We have two specific things that kind of fall under the anxiety disorder umbrella, and that is OCD and PTSD. OCD type disorders are obsessive compulsive disorders, what OCD stands for, and it's characterized by obsessions and or compulsions. Obsessions are thoughts that you just can't get rid of. For instance, somebody just keeps thinking about germs. Everything they see, they think about the germs behind it. They're just obsessed with germs. You've heard the term, I'm obsessed with something. Obsessions are you have these thoughts and you can't get rid of them. Compulsions are you want to perform an action, and performing that action, you can't relieve the anxiety until you perform that action. Now, what are some common OCD? What does it typically look like? But commonly, the stereotypical OCD would be something like somebody who washes their hands a lot, that is constantly thinking about germs and feels anxious unless everything is completely clean. and they wash their hands entirely because they don't think they can get clean. Another thing is people constantly checking things. They have the compulsion to double check whether they put the garage door down, double check whether the iron is on. There was a story of a guy who was a photographer, and he ended up not being able to do his job because he would continuously check his camera because he thought there might be something wrong with the camera. Those are some like common OCD. It's that compulsions to do stuff. It can be checking, it can be making things straight and lined up. That's OCD. Hoarding goes along with OCD. It is a specific kind of, really is a compulsion. It's very similar to OCD in terms of, it has a lot of the same things. It's people who collect stuff. There's a show on the Learning Channel called Hoarding Buried Alive. And you can see that it's people who just keeps taking stuff in and they can't help themselves. It's this compulsion. The last thing that falls under the general anxiety umbrella is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's when people have gone through a traumatic event. It was originally called battle fatigue because they've started seeing it in soldiers that had gone through combat. Go through trauma, and you come out of it, some of the symptoms are nightmares, flashbacks, inability to be near anything that even remotely resembles what the trauma was. So, and it's just constant issues. People have heard a lot about PTSD. Now, the thing with PTSD that's interesting is not everybody who goes through a traumatic event ends up having PTSD. In fact, there's this interesting kind of sweet spot in terms of helping people after a traumatic event. Let me explain that. Because you don't want to assume, say something traumatic happens and there's a lot of people involved. It's a natural inclination to help and to come and say, oh, you want to talk about it. We're going to put everybody in therapy that went through it. Not everybody needs that. Some do, some don't. You want to help the people that need it, but not go so overboard that you're causing people that were fine to think, oh, I must not be fine. So it's that enough to help, but not so much that you're shoving it in people's faces that they should be having problems. They found that out with 9/11. There was some question about, because people wanted to help people so much that they did too much and caused people to have issues. Next big type of disorder are mood disorders, and this falls into basically depression and bipolar. Now, depression, feeling sad. Everybody can say, oh, I feel depressed. I've been depressed. There are different types of depression when I'm talking like clinically in terms of diagnosable disorder depression. Okay, two different kinds. There's what used to be called dysthymia, which is a depression that is lower grade, but it's just nagging and won't go away. It's that you feel sad. You're not sad enough that you're completely non-functional, but you're just sad and it just won't go away. You're continuing to be sad. Okay? And then there's major depression. There's a major depressive episode, major depression, which is, it may not be that ongoing, but it's severe. It's the type of depression that people can't even get out of bed. Somebody goes AWOL for a while and they sleep 23 hours a day. And then, like I said, they won't even, that's the major depression is the one where it may not last as long, but it seriously causes dysfunction. It seriously impacts a person's ability to function. So that's depression. Well, how's that different than bipolar or manic depression? I mean, you hear on TV bipolar depression. Well, bipolar disorder or manic depression is mood swings. You go depression and then mania, depression, then mania. You flip back and forth. And the depression can look as extensive as a major depressive episode. But then you come out of it and swing high. and you have what's called mania. Mania is you're going 90 mile an hour. It can almost look like schizophrenia because your thinking can be that scattered sometimes. And people will do things like spend tons of money, come up with these grandiose plans, and you're like, what the heck are they talking about? But the issue with bipolar disorder or manic depression is that it's really hard to treat because people, when they get in the manic state, they feel good. They're on top of the world. They don't see what other people are seeing. They feel good, and then they don't take their medicine. So then they crash. And that's the problem. It's hard to treat because people don't want to stay on the medicine the whole time. And it is a disorder that is one of the common treatments is medication. So that's manic depression. The other thing that goes with mood disorders is the issue of suicide. And I say this because suicide is related to depression. I mean, what is the most common reason for suicide? Is somebody's depressed. Suicide is something to talk about primarily because it's been on the increase lately. Teenagers, there's an increase in depression, anxiety, and suicide in teenagers these days. And the question is why? There's a lot of theories out there. I encourage people to look at the different theories. They're from everything from social media to food additives. So there's different theories as to why. But to the fact that the incidence really isn't increasing, we're just better able to diagnose it. So there's a lot of interesting ideas. But suicide attempts have gone up, and there's a gender difference in suicides. Males tend to commit suicide more often than females. Females attempt it more often than males. In other words, more females attempt suicide, but males, when they do it, are more likely to be successful because of the means that they choose. All right, so that's mood disorders. The next thing is schizophrenia. When people think of mental illness, this is one of the first things they think of is schizophrenia. Psychotic. Schizophrenia, its defining feature is a break with reality. The person does not seem to be connected with what's really going on. There are positive and negative symptoms. What do I mean by that? Positive is you're adding something, and those are classic schizophrenic symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. Delusions would be thoughts that just don't make sense. Like if I really thought I was the president of the United States, I'm deluding myself. I'm having a delusion. Okay? If I really thought that the CIA had bugs planted in my house, that's a delusion. Okay? It's a thought that just doesn't make sense. Then the other is hallucinations. Hallucinations are basically seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. It's experiencing something with our senses that is not really there. The most common is auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. Hearing voices is a classic symptom of schizophrenia. So that's the positive symptoms. Negative symptoms are a lack of something. It would be like, I just talk like this and show no emotion whatsoever. And that's an example, flat affect. Other examples would be catatonic schizophrenia, where a person just stops moving. Classic catatonic schizophrenia, a person just doesn't move. So that's negative symptoms. It's interesting to see the difference because different medicines tend to work best for different types of symptoms. So that's what schizophrenia is. What causes it? There's genetic components. There's biological brain differences. There's a dopamine hypothesis, which is the neurotransmitter differences in the brain. There's a hypothesis that there was a virus during pregnancy. Some of the most common ideas are people are born with a biological predisposition, and then around the time, and typically young adulthood is when schizophrenia starts to show itself. They go through stress. Young adulthood, a lot of new things happening. They go through stress, and that stress triggers that biological predisposition. That's a diathesis stress model. That's one of the most common thoughts on schizophrenia. So that's schizophrenia. Then we have the dissociative disorders, which are also kind of a break from reality, but this is more personality in terms of your way of acting kind of breaks. Let me explain that. Dissociative identity disorder is the technical name for what is commonly referred to as multiple personalities. So when you think dissociative disorders, think personalities. Think your conception of who you are. And there's multiple personalities. It is a real thing. I know everybody's seen it in the movies. Multiple personality disorder, it's dissociative identity disorder, and it's a real thing. It's one of those where you have to be skeptical because there are some doubts that some of the cases were made up. Dissociative identity disorder does have a big root. A lot of the cases have childhood trauma. Not all, but a lot of them do. So a lot of them have gone through therapy. It's a lot of stuff going on. And we learn in psychology that memories can be messed with. So that's why I'm saying be skeptical. There's dissociative amnesia and dissociative fugue also, which are people losing track of who they are. The last two, personality disorders and developmental disorders. Personality disorders, I'm going to talk about a couple of the big ones. Borderline personality disorder, found in females more than males. And think about it kind of, I want to say drama queen, but think about the person that is very clingy, very like every second they get in a relationship and they go all into it, and then every second they think the person's going to break up with them. Oh no, oh no, oh no. And they're always worried about something, and it's just drama, drama, drama. That's borderline personality disorder. It's just think about, I picture a drama queen. But it has a lot of insecurities, a lot of clinginess associated with it also. Then there's antisocial. Antisocial is one of the biggie personality disorders, and that's found in males more often than females. And antisocial does not, I repeat, not mean that the person doesn't want to have social relationships. It does not mean that. Antisocial is a person who does not think about the consequences of their actions on other people. Think about it as a person who has a weak to no conscience. They don't empathize. They don't understand. They're not getting the impact that their actions have on others. And that's why you see when you look at serial killers, a lot of them can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder because they're just not emotionally connecting. They're not thinking about the consequence of their actions on others. People with antisocial can be very charming, can be very social, but they do it to get what they want. They can act, think Ted Bundy, they can act nice on the outside. They can put on a show. They have social skills in that respect. But on the inside, they're not really empathizing with other people and understanding the impact of their actions. That's antisocial. There's also schizoid, schizotypal, avoidant, and paranoid. Avoidant and paranoid. Avoidant is a person who doesn't want who is scared to have social relationships. They want it, but they're scared. Paranoid is a lighter version of paranoid schizophrenia. In other words, a person who's always seeing the negative, just personality-wise. They're always thinking people are out to get them. They're distrustful. It doesn't go so far as a total break from reality. And they can be convinced, but it's like that's always their first go-to. And then we have schizoid and schizotypal, and you're talking about one that's like a mild, like not schizophrenia, but a milder version, and then another where people just don't want social interaction. They don't care about it. The last thing on the list in terms of psychological disorders are, as a developmental psychologist, the ones I find the most interesting, and the two common disorders in childhood, ADHD and autism spectrum disorders. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a disorder usually diagnosed in childhood, but adults can definitely have ADHD too. And it's a inability to have a long-term focused attention. It's having trouble focusing, essentially. Easily distracted. So it can be mild to severe. And the big question about ADHD right now is it really on the rise? Are people just more aware of it, so they're diagnosing it now? Or is it being overdiagnosed? There's some questions there. And then the question of medication. So thinking about therapy. The last developmental disorder is autism spectrum disorder. And the autism spectrum disorder is usually diagnosed in childhood again. And it's this lack of social awareness in terms of just they don't get social connections. It's not like they are antisocial in terms of it's not that they're narcissistic or not thinking about other people. It's just that they don't get it. They don't understand it. It's not that they don't want to socialize. It's just that a lot of times people with autism get overstimulated very easily, and they just find it difficult to read social cues. Now, so that's the thing, is having difficulty reading social cues. It also presents in terms of symptoms with a lot of repetitive behaviors, the hand flapping, the spinning, things like that. So you see those. You don't see that with everybody that has autism. The big thing that I want people to take away in terms of autism spectrum is that there is such a wide range. There are kids who are autistic who can hardly function, that are nonverbal, just not able to do much of anything, to people that you wouldn't know they had it unless somebody told you. They are so high functioning that you have to look for it. Okay? That's to everywhere in the middle. I mean, there's extremely high functioning. There's people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder who function, but when you look at them, you would say, they're a little off. They just don't get they don't get social cues very well. They're just a little off. To people who are extremely low functioning. So that's what I want you to take away. It's a wide variety. Okay, that's psychological disorders. It's tempting to take all this and start diagnosing yourself and diagnosing your friends. Don't do that. A lot of this stuff is interesting, but it does take a trained professional to even begin to diagnose a mental health disorder, and even then, it's not perfect.